Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't swinging a sword. It's opening your heart to strangers who need you most. In the harsh mountains of ancient Norway, a lonely giant named Hroald had given up on finding family until fate brought two starving sisters to his doorstep. This massive Viking warrior found Ragna and Tyra hiding in his stable, half dead from cold and hunger after their village was burned. Instead of turning them away, he knelt down and offered them everything: food, warmth, and a place to belong. The twins knew herbs and healing. He knew protection and strength. Together they built something beautiful from the ashes of their broken pasts. But when the cruel jarl who destroyed the sisters' home discovers where they found refuge, their new family faces its greatest test. Can love and loyalty triumph over violence and revenge? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the highland fjords like the memories that haunted Hroald Ironhand's sleep. From his stone cottage perched on the cliff's edge, he could see the weathered wooden cross hanging above his doorway, carved from driftwood during his first winter of solitude when the weight of his past had nearly crushed him. The cross caught the early light, its simple lines a reminder of the peace he'd sought in these remote mountains after 30 years of blood and battle. Hroald stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders bearing scars that told stories he refused to speak. His hands, once steady on sword and shield, now worked the earth with surprising gentleness. The villagers in the valley below whispered about the giant who lived alone. Some called him cursed, others blessed. Most simply left him be, understanding that certain men needed distance from the world to find themselves again. His farm stretched across 15 acres of stubborn highland soil, carved from wilderness through sheer will and endless labor. The stable stood solid against northern winds, built from pine logs he'd felled and shaped himself. Inside, 3 horses shared space with a milk cow and a handful of sheep. Modest livestock for a man who'd once commanded hundreds of warriors. But Hroald had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in gold or glory. The kitchen held memories of his mother's cooking, though he'd lived alone for 8 years now. Iron pots hung from wooden beams, and dried herbs lined shelves he'd built with his own hands. A worn wooden table dominated the center, large enough for the family he'd never had. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he'd catch himself setting out extra bowls from habit, then remember that silence was his only companion. His bedroom remained Spartan: a simple bed, a chest for clothes, and a small shrine where he kept his father's battle axe. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what he'd chosen to leave behind. The axe hadn't tasted blood in 8 years, and Hroald intended to keep it that way. Violence had taken too much from him already. The surrounding landscape reflected his inner peace. Rolling hills dotted with pine groves, stone outcroppings worn smooth by centuries of wind, and streams that sang their way down to the fjords. Wildlife moved freely across his land: deer, rabbits, the occasional bear. He'd made a pact with the wild things. They didn't threaten his livestock, and he didn't hunt them. It was a bargain that suited everyone. His days followed a rhythm as steady as the tides. Dawn brought feeding chores, followed by work in the fields or repairs around the farm. Midday meant a simple meal and rest. Afternoons were for wood cutting, fence mending, or tending his small garden. Evenings belonged to contemplation and the careful maintenance of his weapons. Not for war, but from respect for the tools that had once saved his life. The villagers below knew him as a man of few words, but many kindnesses. When storms threatened their fishing boats, Hroald would appear on the docks without being asked, his massive frame helping to secure vessels and mend nets. When winter brought hardship, anonymous gifts of firewood and preserved meat would appear on doorsteps. No one spoke of these acts directly, but gratitude had a way of traveling on mountain winds. His past remained a closed book, sealed with grief too deep for casual conversation. The villagers respected this silence, understanding that some stories were too heavy for ordinary telling. They'd seen the way his eyes grew distant when children played in the streets, the careful distance he kept from their festivals and celebrations. Whatever war had taken from him, it had carved hollow spaces that solitude couldn't entirely fill. The local blacksmith, old Magnus with his silver beard and knowing eyes, was perhaps the closest thing Hroald had to a friend. Their conversations happened mostly in companionable silence, sharing ale while Magnus worked his forge and Hroald mended tack or sharpened tools. Sometimes Magnus would speak of his own losses, a wife taken by fever, sons who'd sailed away seeking fortune, and Hroald would listen with the patience of someone who understood that grief needed witnessing. "A man can't live on mountain air and regret forever," Magnus had said once, not looking up from the horseshoe he was shaping. "The heart needs more than solitude to heal properly." Hroald had nodded but offered no response. Healing felt like a luxury he couldn't afford, a risk too great to take. Better to tend his animals and work his land than to open himself to loss again. The cross above his door reminded him daily that peace came through surrender, through laying down the weapons of the heart as surely as those of the hand. Yet something in him remained restless, incomplete. In quiet moments, he'd catch himself listening for voices that never came, preparing for guests who never arrived. The farmhouse felt too large, the table too empty, the silence too absolute. He'd built a sanctuary, but sanctuaries could become prisons when they held only one soul. The seasons marked time's passage without urgency. Spring brought planting and birthing, summer the endless work of growth and tending. Autumn meant harvest and preparation, while winter demanded endurance and reflection. Year followed year in peaceful repetition, each one healing small wounds while leaving others untouched. His sleep brought dreams of battle and brotherhood, of comrades lost and enemies fallen, but also dreams of laughter around hearth fires, of children's voices, of a woman's gentle touch. These visions hurt worst of all, showing him glimpses of the life he might have lived if war hadn't claimed everything he'd once held dear. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the hillsides in brilliant reds and golds, Hroald moved through his routine with the same deliberate care that marked all his days. The horses nickered their greeting, breath steaming in the crisp air. The cow lowed softly as he milked her, and the sheep pressed close for the warmth of human contact. These simple creatures asked nothing of him but care and consistency, gifts he could offer without risk to his guarded heart. As he worked, the weathered cross above his door continued its silent witness, symbol of a peace earned through sacrifice and maintained through careful distance from the world's pain. Soon, though neither he nor the cross could know it, that carefully constructed solitude would be tested in ways that would transform them all. The storm arrived without warning on the third night of autumn's darkest moon, bringing with it winds that howled like banshees across the highland peaks. Hroald had seen such tempests before, nature's way of reminding mortals that some forces couldn't be conquered, only endured. He'd secured the animals early, checked the roof ties twice, and settled by his hearth with hot ale and the steady rhythm of rain against stone walls. Thunder rolled across the mountains in great, booming waves that seemed to shake the earth itself. Lightning split the darkness in brilliant, terrifying displays that turned his windows into mirrors of white fire. Between the crashes, he could hear his animals shifting restlessly in the stable, their instincts telling them this was no ordinary storm. Near midnight, a particularly violent gust rattled his door so hard that the weathered wooden cross above it swayed on its iron nail. Something about that movement unsettled him. The cross had weathered 8 years of storms without stirring. As if responding to his unease, the wind died suddenly, leaving an unnatural quiet that felt more ominous than the tempest itself. In that silence, Hroald heard something that made his blood run cold, the high, keening wail of a woman in distress. It came from the direction of his stable, barely audible above the rain, but unmistakably human. Every instinct honed by decades of warfare screamed at him to investigate, even as his more cautious mind wondered if grief and isolation had finally driven him to hearing voices in the wind. He pulled on his heavy cloak and took up the iron-headed staff he kept by the door. Not quite a weapon, but substantial enough to discourage wolves or desperate thieves. The rain struck him like icy needles as he stepped into the storm, soaking through his wool in moments. Mud sucked at his boots as he made his way across the yard, guided by memory more than sight in the near-total darkness. The stable door hung slightly ajar, though he was certain he'd barred it securely. Heart pounding with the familiar tension of approaching danger, Hroald eased the door wider and stepped into the relative shelter of the building. His animals stood pressed against the far wall, eyes wide with an alarm that had nothing to do with thunder. And there, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the window, he saw them. 2 young women huddled in the hay of the far stall, their clothes torn and travel-stained, their faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. They couldn't have seen more than 20 summers between them, though hardship had aged their eyes beyond their years. The resemblance between them was so striking that they could only be sisters, perhaps twins, though one was slightly taller than the other. Both had the pale hair and grey eyes common to the Highland clans, and both watched him with the desperate wariness of cornered animals. The taller of the 2 held a small eating knife in her trembling hand, its blade barely long enough to pare fruit, but raised in defiance nonetheless. Her sister pressed close behind her, one hand clutching a leather satchel while the other gripped her sibling's shoulder for support. Neither spoke, but their ragged breathing and the terror in their eyes told a story that needed no words. Hroald froze in the doorway, understanding immediately that any sudden movement might send them bolting into the storm, or worse, drive them to some desperate act of violence. These weren't common thieves seeking shelter. Something terrible had driven them to seek refuge in a stranger's stable, something that had left them more afraid of human contact than of the wild elements. "Peace," he said softly, his deep voice gentle despite its natural rumble. He set his staff carefully against the door frame and raised his empty hands where they could see them. "I mean no harm. This is my stable, my farm. You're safe here." The shorter sister whispered something urgent to her companion, too quiet for him to catch the words, but he recognized the tone. She was arguing for trust while her sister counseled caution. It was a debate he'd seen played out countless times among refugees and survivors, the eternal struggle between hope and hard-won wisdom. "My name is Hroald," he continued, taking a single, slow step forward. "I live alone here. No one else will come. You can lower the blade. I give you my word that you have nothing to fear from me." The taller sister's knife hand wavered but didn't drop. "Your word," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and unshed tears. "What worth does a stranger's word carry in times like these?" Her accent marked her as Highland-born, but from somewhere far to the east, beyond the great peaks that divided the clans. Whatever had brought them here, they'd traveled a long and dangerous road to reach his isolated farm. The fact that they'd survived the journey at all spoke to considerable strength and determination. "Fair question," Hroald admitted, settling into a crouch that made him seem less towering and threatening. "My word carries only the weight I've given it through years of keeping it. But look around you. If I meant harm, would I have announced myself? Would I stand here talking when I could have surprised you in the dark?" The sisters exchanged another whispered conference. The shorter one seemed to be winning the argument, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Finally, the taller sister lowered her knife, though she didn't sheath it entirely. "We mean no theft," she said carefully. "We sought only shelter from the storm. Come dawn, we'll trouble you no further." But Hroald was already shaking his head, rising slowly to his full height. Now that his eyes had adjusted to the dim light, He could see the true state of them, the hollow cheeks that spoke of too many missed meals, the way they favored certain limbs that suggested old injuries improperly healed. These weren't travelers caught by unexpected weather. These were refugees, possibly the only survivors of some tragedy that had left them with nothing but each other. "When did you last eat?" he asked simply. The question broke something in the shorter sister's composure. She pressed her face against her sibling's shoulder, and Hroald heard the quiet sounds of weeping she could no longer contain. The taller one's face hardened with protective anger, but before she could speak, her own stomach betrayed her with a growl audible across the stable. 3 days, she admitted reluctantly. Maybe 4. We lost count. Hroald felt something shift inside his chest, like the first crack in ice that signals spring's arrival. These weren't threats to his carefully maintained peace. They were exactly what Magnus had warned him about. Hearts in need of healing, just as his own had been all those years ago. The difference was that his wounds had been earned in battle, while theirs seemed born of circumstance and cruelty. "Come," he said, stepping back toward the door. "The storm shows no sign of breaking, and you'll catch your deaths sleeping in wet hay. I have food and warm beds, and no questions that can't wait until you've strength to answer them." The sisters looked at each other again, and in that shared glance, Hroald saw the moment when survival overcame suspicion. They were too tired, too hungry, and too cold to refuse sanctuary any longer, regardless of the risks it might bring. Whatever they were fleeing from seemed less immediate than the promise of warmth and food from a gentle giant who'd offered help without demanding explanations. As they gathered their few possessions and followed him into the storm, Hroald felt the weathered wooden cross above his door watching over them all, a silent witness to the moment when his long exile began to end. The sisters moved like ghosts through his cottage, their bare feet silent on the stone floor as they followed him inside. Hroald lit additional candles, pushing back the darkness that seemed to cling to their travel-worn clothes. In the warmer light, he could see them more clearly, and what he saw made his jaw tighten with barely controlled anger. The taller sister bore a fading bruise along her left cheek, yellow-green with age, but still visible. Her companion's wrists showed rope burns, partially healed but unmistakable. These weren't just refugees from some natural disaster or clan feud. Someone had hurt them deliberately, and recently enough that the marks remained as evidence. "Sit," he said gently, gesturing toward the wooden table. "Let me build up the fire and prepare something warm." They obeyed with the cautious compliance of people accustomed to violence, settling on the bench with space between them and the room's exits carefully measured. The shorter sister clutched her leather satchel as if it contained everything precious left in the world. Her companion kept the eating knife within easy reach, despite Hroald's obvious peaceful intentions. He worked quickly but without rush, understanding that sudden movements might startle them. The iron pot went onto its hook above the flames, filled with water and the last of his preserved vegetables. Bread came from the wooden box where he kept it wrapped in linen, along with fresh butter and a pot of honey his bees had made that summer. "My name is Ragna," the taller sister said suddenly, her voice still hoarse but stronger in the cottage's warmth. "This is Tyra, my twin. We're grateful for your kindness, but we don't wish to bring trouble to your door." Hroald paused in his preparations, meeting her eyes directly. "What manner of trouble?" Tyra spoke for the first time since entering his home, her voice softer than her sister's but carrying an undertone of steel. "The kind that follows those who flee from powerful men's anger. We should eat and rest tonight, then continue our journey before dawn." "And go where?" he asked, not unkindly. "The nearest settlement is 2 days' hard travel through mountain passes that claim lives even in good weather. You'll not survive another night in the wild, especially with winter coming early this year." The sisters exchanged that look again, part communication, part argument conducted in glances and subtle gestures that spoke of a lifetime spent understanding each other without words. Ragnar's hand found Tyra's across the table, their fingers interlacing in a gesture that seemed as natural as breathing. "We're herb wives," Tyra said finally, opening her leather satchel to reveal bundles of dried plants, small clay vessels, and tools that Hroald recognized as being used for healing work. Our village is gone. Those who did it blame us for speaking against their actions." Hroald ladled stew into wooden bowls, processing this information. Herb wives were valuable members of any community. Healers, midwives, keepers of plant lore, passed down through generations of women. To drive such people away suggested either madness or cruelty beyond the usual bounds of even violent men. "Who?" he asked simply, setting food before them. Ragnar's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "You don't want that knowledge. It's dangerous even to speak his name in these mountains." But Hroald had spent too many years as a war chief to accept evasive answers when the safety of those under his protection might be at stake. "If I'm to shelter you properly, I need to know what I'm sheltering you from. A drunk neighbor with grievances is different from a jarl with blood debt to settle." The twins looked at each other again, and in that moment of silent communication, some decision was reached. Tyra nodded almost imperceptibly, and Ragnar straightened as if preparing to shoulder a heavy burden. "Jarl Grim Bloodaxe," she said quietly. "He came to our village demanding tribute, not just silver and grain, but young women for his warrior's pleasure. When the village elders refused, he burned half the houses and took what he wanted anyway. We spoke against it, called him coward and worse." Hroald's blood chilled. He knew that name, knew it from dark tales that traveled between settlements like infection. Grim Bloodaxe was no petty local tyrant, but a jarl with holdings across 3 fjords and warriors enough to raid wherever he pleased. The man's cruelty was legendary, matched only by his cunning and his absolute refusal to forgive any slight, real or imagined. "You spoke truth," he said carefully. "But truth can be the most dangerous weapon of all when spoken to the wrong ears." Tyra's laugh held no humor. "We learned that lesson too late. He made examples of others who'd spoken against him, then declared us marked for capture. Dead or alive, he said, though he made it clear he preferred us breathing so we could suffer properly for our insolence." The implications settled over the cottage like a cold fog. These women hadn't just fled some local trouble, they'd made an enemy of one of the most dangerous men in all the Highland territories. Worse, they'd done it for the best of reasons, standing up for their neighbors against injustice that demanded speaking against. "How long ago?" Hroald asked, though he dreaded the answer. 6 weeks, Ragnar said. "We've been moving mostly by night, sleeping rough, trading herb lore for food when we could find villages that didn't know our faces. But word travels fast when there's silver offered for information. We're running out of places to hide." Hroald set down his own bowl, appetite gone. 6 weeks meant Grim had time to send trackers, to spread word through his network of allies and informants. It meant the sisters had been living on borrowed time, staying just ahead of pursuit that would inevitably close the distance. And now they'd brought that danger to his doorstep, not deliberately, but inevitably. "There's something else," Tyra said, her voice dropping even lower. "The reason we came this far north, away from the traveled roads, we heard rumors that a great warrior lived in these mountains, a man who'd turned his back on war but still remembered how to fight when fighting was needed. Someone called Ironhand." The cottage went very quiet, except for the crackling of the fire. Hroald felt the weight of his past settling around his shoulders like an old cloak, heavy with memories he'd tried so hard to set aside. The twins watched him with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. "That man is dead," he said finally. "He died 8 years ago when he hung up his weapons and came to these mountains seeking peace." "But you kept the weapons," Ragnar observed quietly. "We saw them when you lit the candles. The axe above the bed, the sword wrapped in leather by the door. Dead men don't maintain their tools." Hroald closed his eyes, feeling the careful walls he'd built around his new life. beginning to crack. Those are reminders of what I choose not to be. I came here to escape violence, not to find new reasons for it. We're not asking you to fight, Tyra said quickly. Just to shelter us until we can find another way, somewhere else to go where Grimm's reach can't follow. But even as she spoke the words, all three of them knew the truth. There was nowhere in all the Highland territories where Grim blood axe's reach couldn't eventually follow. The man's network of allies and purchased loyalties stretched across hundreds of miles. Sooner or later, word would reach him that the Herb wives had been seen in the northern mountains, and when it did, he would come for them with all the fury of a man whose authority had been publicly challenged. The weathered wooden cross above the door seemed to watch over them in the flickering candlelight, a reminder of the peace Hroald had found, and the choice he now faced between preserving that peace and protecting two innocent women who'd already lost everything to one man's cruelty. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountain peaks, but inside the cottage, warmth had begun to work its healing magic. The sisters slept deeply in the small room Hroald had prepared for them, their faces finally peaceful after weeks of constant vigilance. He'd given them his own bed, taking blankets by the fire, a small sacrifice that felt larger in its symbolism of trust offered and accepted. From his kitchen window, he watched the storm's aftermath reveal itself in the growing light. Broken branches littered the yard, and small streams carved new channels through his garden where the rain had been heaviest. Nature's violence had passed, leaving behind the slow work of recovery and rebuilding. He wondered if the same could be said for the violence that had touched the lives of his unexpected guests. Tyra emerged first, moving quietly so as not to wake her sister. She'd braided her pale hair back and wore one of Hroald's clean shirts over her patched dress. It hung almost to her knees, but she seemed more comfortable in borrowed cleanliness than travel-stained clothes. Her gray eyes held wariness still, but also something new, the cautious hope of someone daring to believe in sanctuary. "You didn't have to give us your bed," she said softly, settling at the table where he'd already laid out bread and milk. "We're accustomed to sleeping rough." "No guest of mine sleeps on the ground while beds stand empty," Hroald replied, pouring hot tea from the pot he'd kept warm. "How long since you've had proper rest?" She considered the question seriously, as if sleep had become such a luxury that she'd lost track of its absence. "Weeks. We've been taking turns keeping watch since we left our village. One sleeps while the other listens for pursuit." The casual mention of such precautions drove home the reality of their situation. These weren't women fleeing some minor dispute, but people whose lives had been reduced to survival's basic requirements: food, shelter, and the constant need to stay ahead of those who meant them harm. "Your sister spoke of herb lore last night," Hroald said, settling across from her with his own cup. "What manner of healing do you practice?" Tyra's face brightened with the first genuine smile he'd seen from either twin. "All manner. Ragna knows birthing lore and the plants that ease women's pain. I work more with battle wounds and break fevers. Between us, we kept our village healthy for 5 years before—" She trailed off, the smile fading. "Before Grim came?" he finished gently. "Before everything changed," she agreed. "We had a good life there. People trusted us, brought us their troubles. Children would follow us into the forest to learn which plants could heal and which could harm. It felt like we were carrying on something important, something our grandmother had passed to us." The weight of loss in her voice made Hroald's chest tighten. He recognized that particular grief, the mourning not just for what had been taken, but for what would never be again. "Your grandmother taught you?" "She raised us after our parents died of the wasting fever. 9 winters we spent learning her ways, memorizing every plant's virtue and danger. She made us promise to use the knowledge well, to help rather than harm." Tyra's fingers traced the rim of her cup, her voice growing distant. "We thought we were keeping that promise when we spoke against Grim's cruelty." Ragna appeared in the doorway then, fully dressed but moving with the careful stiffness of someone whose body hadn't forgotten recent hardships. She studied the domestic scene before her, her sister sharing tea with their massive host, morning light streaming through clean windows, the simple peace of safety, and Hroald saw her struggle between gratitude and wariness. "Good morning," he said, rising to pour more tea. "I hope the bed served you well." "Better than we've known in weeks," she admitted, settling beside Tyra. "You have our thanks for that kindness. But we should discuss our departure plans. The longer we remain, the greater the danger to you." Hroald had spent much of the night considering exactly that question. His years as a war chief had taught him to think strategically about threats and resources, to plan several moves ahead of any opponent. The conclusion he had reached wasn't one that aligned with his desire for continued peace, but it was the only logical response to their situation. "Where would you go?" he asked simply. "Which direction offers safety that you haven't already considered?" The sisters exchanged that wordless communication again, and he could see them reaching the same conclusion he had. There was nowhere left to run. Grim's influence extended too far, his resources too vast, his grudges too long-lasting. They could flee for months or years, but eventually they would be found. "There are other lands across the Western Sea," Ragna said without conviction. "Places where Highland names carry no weight." "And how would you reach these distant shores?" Hroald pressed. "The nearest port is controlled by jarls who trade favors with Grim. Even if you could book passage, ship captains talk and gold buys information as easily as silence." Tyra set down her cup with hands that trembled slightly. "Then what do you counsel? We cannot simply wait here for him to find us. That would bring his wrath down on you as well, and we won't repay your kindness with such danger." It was the opening Hroald had been waiting for, the moment to voice the plan that had formed during his sleepless hours. "There is another option, one that requires trust on all our parts and carries risks I won't minimize." Both sisters leaned forward, their attention complete. In their faces, he saw the desperate hope of people who'd run out of alternatives and were willing to consider even dangerous possibilities. "We make a stand here," he continued, "not by running or hiding, but by preparing for the confrontation that will come regardless. This farm is defensible, isolated enough that approach can be watched for miles. More importantly, it's my ground, and I know every stone and stream for leagues in any direction." "You're talking about fighting," Ragna said slowly. "About returning to what you left behind." "I'm talking about protection," Hroald corrected. "About using skills I'd hoped never to need again, but still possess when innocent lives are at stake. Grim expects to find 2 frightened herb wives in hiding. He won't expect to find them defended by someone who knows his methods." Tyra's eyes had grown bright with something between fear and fierce hope. "You would do this? Risk your peace, your safety, for strangers who brought this trouble to your door?" The weathered wooden cross caught the morning light as Hroald considered her question. Peace bought with the suffering of others wasn't true peace at all, but merely the luxury of turning away from the world's pain. His 8 years of solitude had healed old wounds, but perhaps they'd also been preparing him for this moment, when healing and protection would require the very skills he'd tried so hard to set aside. "You're not strangers anymore," he said simply. "You're guests in my home, under my protection, and I've never abandoned those who trusted me to keep them safe." The days that followed settled into a rhythm unlike anything Hroald's farm had ever known. Where once silence had been his closest companion, now the cottage hummed with quiet conversation, the soft sounds of women's work, and an unexpected sense of purpose that seemed to breathe new life into the weathered stone walls. Tyra proved to be a natural teacher, her knowledge of plants both extensive and practical. She showed Hroald which roots could numb pain and which leaves could stem bleeding, transforming his simple garden into something resembling an apothecary's paradise. Under her guidance, they expanded the herb plots, preparing not just for healing but for the possibility that battlefield medicine might soon be needed. "This is comfrey," she explained, kneeling beside a patch of broad-leaved plants. "Crush the root to paste, and it will help bones mend faster. Your grandmother probably called it knitbone. Hroald watched her work, noting how her hands moved with the confidence of years of practice. And this bitter-smelling one? Yarrow. Stops bleeding better than anything else that grows wild in these mountains. You'll want to harvest extra. Dried yarrow keeps through winter and works nearly as well as fresh. She looked up at him seriously. If what you say about fighting is true, you'll need considerable stores. Ragna's contributions proved equally valuable, though in different ways. Her knowledge centered on women's healing and the subtle arts of brewing medicines that worked over time rather than in moments of crisis. More importantly, she possessed an intuitive understanding of strategy that surprised even Hroald. "The approach from the eastern pass is too narrow," she said, studying the terrain from his cottage window. "No more than 3 men could ride abreast, and the path switchbacks enough that archers above could command the entire route. If they come that way, it's because they don't know the land." "And if they do know the land?" he asked, impressed by her tactical thinking. "Then they'll split their force, a small group up the eastern pass to draw attention, while the main body approaches from the south through the forest. That route offers better concealment, but requires them to fight uphill across open ground for the final approach." Her analysis proved remarkably sound when Hroald scouted both routes himself. The sisters might be herb wives by training, but their weeks of flight had taught them to think like hunted creatures, always aware of approaches and escape routes, always planning for the worst possibilities. As the women shared their knowledge, Hroald found himself returning skills he'd hoped never to use again. The leather-wrapped sword by his door came out of its wrappings, its steel still bright despite years of disuse. His father's battle axe received the same careful attention, its edge restored to razor sharpness on the whetstone that had gathered dust for too long. But it was the making of new tools that truly marked the change in his household's character. Working by firelight after the day's other tasks were done, he forged arrowheads by the dozen, their points designed to punch through mail and leather with equal efficiency. The familiar weight of hammer against steel felt strange at first, but muscle memory proved stronger than conscious resistance. "You work iron like a master smith," Ragna observed one evening, watching him shape metal that glowed cherry red in the forge's heat. "Is that another skill from your warrior days?" "A war chief who depends on others for his weapons is a war chief who dies when supply lines are cut," Hroald replied, not looking up from his work. "I learned the smith's trade because steel that fails in battle takes lives with it." The conversation that followed revealed more about his past than he'd intended to share. Stories emerged of campaigns fought in distant lands, of winters spent in fortress cities where warriors maintained their equipment between battles, of the careful balance between leading men and keeping them alive through superior preparation. "You speak of it like it was someone else's life," Tyra noted, as if those memories belonged to a different person entirely. Hroald set down his hammer, studying the arrowhead he'd just completed. "In many ways, they do. That man lived for battle, found purpose in conflict and brotherhood in shared danger. This man sought peace in solitude and found healing in simple work. They share a body and memories, but little else. Yet here you are, preparing for war again," Ragna pointed out gently. "What does that say about the peace you found?" It was a question that had been troubling him for days, one that grew more pressing each time he took up hammer or whetstone. Perhaps it says that some kinds of peace are worth fighting to preserve. Or perhaps it means that peace built on turning away from the world's suffering isn't peace at all, but merely postponed responsibility. The weathered wooden cross above his door seemed to approve of this conclusion, its simple lines catching the firelight as if offering silent benediction to the work being done below. Peace through strength, protection through preparation. These weren't concepts his faith rejected, but ones it blessed when used to shield the innocent from harm. As autumn deepened toward winter, their preparations took on increased urgency. Word had begun to filter north through the network of traders and travelers that connected even remote settlements. Grim Bloodaxe was asking questions, offering silver for information, making it known that his patience with the herb wives' flight was wearing thin. "How long do we have?" Tyra asked, after a merchant brought particularly disturbing news. Grim's warriors had been seen questioning villagers only 2 days' ride to the south. A week, perhaps 2 if the weather turns bad enough to slow travel, Hroald estimated. Long enough to finish our preparations, but not long enough for second thoughts or elaborate strategies. When he comes, it will be direct and brutal. That's his way. The sisters absorbed this information with the stoic acceptance of people who'd already lost everything once and weren't willing to lose what little they'd found again. Their responses in the days that followed showed character that impressed even Hroald's experienced judgment. Ragna spent her time creating what she called battlefield blessings, concentrated tinctures and pastes that could be applied quickly to wounds that wouldn't wait for careful tending. Her sister focused on preparing what they grimly termed the aftermath supplies, materials for treating burns, punctures, and the kinds of injuries that would need attention if their defense succeeded but came at cost. "You both prepare as if you expect to be part of the fighting," Hroald observed one evening, watching them work by lamplight. "We won't cower in a cellar while you face danger alone," Ragna replied firmly. "We've seen what running accomplished. It only delayed the confrontation and put an innocent man at risk. This time, we stand and fight." Her words carried a finality that brooked no argument, and looking at the sisters' faces in the lamp's warm glow, Hroald realized that something had changed in them as well. The frightened refugees he'd sheltered were transforming into women prepared to defend what they'd found, not just safety, but belonging, purpose, and the first true home they'd known since their grandmother's death. The weathered wooden cross watched over them all as they prepared for the storm to come, a symbol of the peace they'd found together and were now determined to preserve, whatever the cost. The first snow arrived 3 days ahead of Grim's warriors, transforming the highland landscape into a world of stark beauty and tactical complexity. From his cottage window, Hroald watched the white powder settle into the folds and crevices of his carefully memorized terrain, knowing that weather could be as valuable an ally as any weapon if used properly. "The snow changes everything," he told the sisters as they gathered around his rough map drawn in charcoal on a piece of scraped hide. Tracks become visible for days instead of hours. Movement makes noise that carries farther in cold air, but it also provides concealment and can hide prepared positions until the moment of contact. Ragna traced the lines he'd drawn with one finger, studying the approaches to their farm with eyes that had grown sharp during their weeks of flight. "It slows horses more than men on foot, doesn't it? Makes cavalry charges less effective on uphill ground." Exactly. And Grim's reputation suggests he favors mounted attacks, fast strikes that rely on shock and overwhelming force. Snow and steep terrain will force him to fight differently than he prefers. Tyra looked up from the medicinal supplies she was organizing for the 3rd time that week. What if he simply waits, surrounds us and starves us out instead of attacking directly? It was a shrewd question that revealed how much the sisters had learned about warfare during their time as refugees. Possible, but unlikely given what we know of his character. Grim is proud, easily angered, and accustomed to quick victories. A siege requires patience he's never shown before. More importantly, winter is coming hard this year. His men won't want to camp in these mountains when they could be warming themselves in comfortable halls. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all 3 of them freeze. The distant baying of hounds carried on the wind from the south. Not the casual barking of farm dogs, but the deep, sustained calls of hunting animals following a scent trail. "How far?" Ragna whispered, though the nearest neighbor lived miles away and wouldn't hear them regardless. Hroald was already moving toward his weapons, his mind shifting into the focused state that had kept him alive through decades of combat. 2 miles, perhaps 3. Close enough that they've found sign of you, distant enough that we have time to prepare. The next few hours passed in controlled urgency. The sisters gathered their medical supplies and moved them to the stone root cellar that would serve as their fallback position if the cottage became untenable. Hroald distributed the weapons they'd prepared, a hunting bow for Tyra, who'd proven surprisingly accurate during their practice sessions, and a long knife for Ragna that was more sword than eating blade. "Remember what we've practiced," he said as they took their positions. "Tyra, you cover the eastern approach from the stable loft. That window gives you sight lines down both the switchback trail and the open ground below. Ragna, you're with me at the cottage. Watch the forest edge while I handle anyone who makes it to close quarters." The weathered wooden cross above his door caught the last light of the short winter day as they settled into position. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, enemies approached with violence in mind and cruelty in their hearts. But for the first time in 8 years, Hroald felt something he'd forgotten, the fierce satisfaction of standing between those he cared about and those who would harm them. The attack came at first light, just as he'd expected. Grim's tactical thinking proved disappointingly predictable. A frontal assault by mounted warriors who expected to find frightened women hiding in a defenseless cottage. They charged up the slope in a thunder of hoofbeats, weapons raised and voices lifted in war cries meant to terrorize their prey into submission. Tyra's first arrow took the lead rider in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle with a cry that was more surprise than pain. Her second shot missed its mark, but struck his horse in the neck, sending the animal stumbling and throwing the formation into confusion. The other riders had to rein in hard to avoid trampling their fallen comrade, exactly as Hroald had hoped. "Now," he called softly, and stepped from behind the stone wall that marked his property's edge. The sight of him, 7 feet of muscle and scars wielding a battle axe that gleamed with deadly promise, brought the charge to a complete halt. One of the riders actually backed his horse several steps, recognizing in that massive figure something far more dangerous than they'd been led to expect. "I am Hroald Ironhand," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow-covered ground. "Once war chief to King Hroald, veteran of 30 campaigns, slayer of more men than you have years among you. You seek the herb wives who shelter under my protection. Turn back now and live to see tomorrow's sunrise." A younger warrior, his beard barely grown and his armor still bright with newness, urged his horse forward. "We serve Jarl Grim Bloodaxe, old man. Give us the women, and we'll let you die quickly." Hroald's laugh was like winter wind through bare branches. "Boy, when your Jarl was learning to hold a sword, I was teaching kings how to wage war. Grim sends children to do work that requires men." The insult hit home exactly as intended. The young warrior spurred his horse into a reckless charge, his companions following more from shame than wisdom. But charging uphill through snow against a prepared position proved as foolish as Hroald had known it would be. His axe took the first horse's legs out from under it, sending rider and mount tumbling in a tangle of limbs and screaming that echoed off the mountain walls. A side step and return stroke caught the second warrior across the chest, dropping him into snow that quickly turned red. The third managed to wheel away from the slaughter, but Tyra's bow sang again and he joined his fellows on the ground. The remaining warriors pulled back out of immediate range, their faces showing the kind of shock that came from expecting easy prey and finding instead a killing field prepared by someone who understood their business far better than they did. "This isn't over, old man," one called out, though his voice lacked conviction. "Jarl Grim will hear of this, and his anger will follow you to the ends of the earth." "Then tell your Jarl that Ironhand sends this message," Hroald replied, his axe dripping red onto the pristine snow. "I've stood against better men than him and sent them all to their graves. If he wants the women, he's welcome to come himself instead of sending boys to do his work." As the survivors retreated down the mountain, dragging their wounded with them, Hroald felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and regret that followed violence. The threat was ended for now, but greater dangers would follow. Grim's pride wouldn't allow such a humiliation to go unanswered, and next time he would come prepared for serious opposition. The weathered wooden cross above his door seemed to watch as he cleaned blood from his axe, a reminder that even necessary violence carried costs that would need accounting. But looking at the sisters who emerged from their positions unharmed, he felt no doubt about the choice he'd made. Some kinds of peace were worth whatever price was required to preserve them. 3 days of uneasy quiet followed the battle, broken only by the sound of wind through pine boughs and the sisters' quiet voices as they tended the wounded horse that had survived the skirmish. Hroald had taken it in, unable to let an innocent animal suffer for its master's cruelty, and Tyra's herb lore proved as effective on beasts as it was on men. "She'll recover fully," Tyra reported, stroking the mare's grey muzzle. "The arrow missed anything vital, and the wound is already closing cleanly." Ragna looked up from grinding willow bark into powder. Unlike her former rider, who won't be lifting his sword arm properly for months, assuming he lives long enough to try. The sisters had handled the aftermath of violence with a composure that impressed even Hroald's experienced judgment. Neither had flinched from helping tend the wounded, enemy and friend alike, and both had worked methodically to prepare for whatever would come next. Their transformation from frightened refugees to determined defenders was now complete. The sound of approaching hoofbeats on the 4th morning brought all 3 to their windows, weapons ready and nerves taut. But the rider who appeared through the morning mist carried a white banner of truce and rode alone, a breach of protocol so unusual that Hroald immediately suspected treachery. "I would speak with Hroald Ironhand," the rider called out, remaining well beyond bow range. "I carry words from Jarl Grim Bloodaxe under banner of truce." The man was older than the warriors who'd attacked them, his beard silver-shot, and his bearing suggesting years of experience in matters of war and diplomacy. Most telling of all, he wore no visible weapons and kept his hands clearly in sight, gestures that spoke of genuine intention to parley rather than fight. "Speak your words," Hroald called back, stepping into view with his axe resting on his shoulder. "But know that I've heard enough of your Jarl's promises to last several lifetimes." The messenger urged his horse a few steps closer, though still maintaining respectful distance. "I am Bjorn the Wise, counselor to Jarl Grim and speaker of his will in matters of negotiation. I come with an offer that may interest you." "I doubt that greatly, but I'm listening." Bjorn dismounted entirely, a gesture of respect that surprised Hroald. Few men would show such vulnerability when addressing an enemy known to have killed several of their comrades only days before. "My lord offers terms. Surrender the herb wives to his justice, and you may depart these mountains with your life and whatever possessions you can carry. Refuse, and he will return with sufficient force to take what he wants, regardless of your skill at arms." "And what justice does your lord offer women whose only crime was speaking truth about his cruelty?" Ragna called out from the cottage doorway, her voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered yard. Bjorn's expression flickered with what might have been embarrassment. "The Jarl's justice is not mine to question, my lady. I merely carry his words as instructed." But something in the man's manner suggested deeper currents than simple message-carrying. Hroald had spent too many years reading men's faces in council and battle not to recognize the signs of internal conflict. This Bjorn the Wise was troubled by his lord's commands, possibly even ashamed of them. "How many men does Grim bring to this justice of his?" Hroald asked. 50 warriors, plus camp followers and servants, enough to ensure the outcome, regardless of your legendary skill." Bjorn paused, then added quietly, "More than enough to destroy everything within 20 miles if they're given cause for extended violence." The threat was clear, but so was something else, a warning disguised as intimidation. This counselor was trying to communicate something beyond his official message, though what remained unclear. "Tell your lord that Hroald Ironhand has heard his terms and finds them lacking," Hroald replied formally. "The women remain under my protection, and any who come seeking to harm them will find the same welcome as their predecessors." Bjorn nodded, as if he'd expected no other answer, but as he prepared to mount his horse, he called out one final message that changed everything. "Before I depart, I should mention, my lord was most interested to learn that you shelter not just any herb wives, but the granddaughters of Astrid the Farseer. He says their bloodline makes them far more valuable than he initially realized." The words hit the cottage like a physical blow. Both sisters went, rigid with shock, their faces draining of color as the implications sank home. Hroald felt his own blood chill as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly clicked into place. "What does he mean?" he demanded, but Bjorn was already riding away, his message delivered and his duty complete. Inside the cottage, the sisters faced each other across the wooden table with expressions that mixed fear, anger, and something approaching despair. The careful composure they'd maintained through weeks of flight and days of preparation crumbled as long-held secrets could no longer be contained. "He knows," Tyra whispered, her voice barely audible. "Somehow, he's learned the truth about our grandmother." "What truth?" Hroald demanded, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "What haven't you told me about Astrid the Farseer?" Ragna's hands shook as she reached for the leather satchel she'd carried through all their travels. From its depths, she withdrew something that had been carefully wrapped in silk and hidden beneath the medicinal supplies. A silver pendant bearing runes that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. "Our grandmother wasn't just a healer," she said quietly. "She was the last of the old blood, the final keeper of the sight that lets some women see beyond the present moment. This pendant was hers, and through it, she could glimpse fragments of what was to come." Tyra took up the tale, her voice growing stronger as the truth finally emerged. She saw her own death 3 years before it happened. Saw also that her granddaughters would carry the same gift in their blood, though it might not manifest until they faced great danger or loss. The implications crashed over Hroald like a physical wave. Grim wasn't just seeking revenge for public humiliation. He was hunting women whose bloodline could potentially grant them powers that made them incredibly valuable as captives. Seers were worth kingdoms to the right buyer, their abilities coveted by jarls and kings who would pay any price for glimpses of future events. "Have either of you shown signs of the sight?" he asked, dreading the answer. The sisters exchanged one of their wordless communications, and in that moment of shared understanding, Hroald saw something that made his warrior's heart go cold. They had manifested the gift, probably recently, probably triggered by the trauma of their flight, and they'd been hiding it from him just as they'd hidden their true identity. "Show me," he said simply. Tyra lifted the silver pendant, her fingers tracing the ancient runes with practiced familiarity. As she did, her eyes took on a distant quality, as if she was seeing through layers of time and a possibility that ordinary vision couldn't penetrate. "I see fire," she whispered. "Fire and blood and the sound of many horses. Men with red shields coming up the mountain path in the deep of winter, and I see—" She gasped, her eyes snapping back to the present moment. "I see you standing against them all, your axe gleaming in the firelight, but the vision ends before I can see whether you stand alone or whether others stand with you." The weathered wooden cross above the door seemed to pulse with significance as Hroald absorbed this revelation. Everything he thought he understood about their situation had just become far more complex and dangerous. Grim wasn't coming just for revenge anymore. He was coming to claim prizes that could alter the balance of power across all the Highland territories, and the women he'd sworn to protect carried secrets that made them worth more than their weight in silver to anyone ruthless enough to exploit such gifts. The revelation of the sisters' true heritage cast everything that followed in a darker light. As Hroald worked through their defensive preparations one final time, he found himself studying Ragna and Tyra with new understanding. The quick, tactical thinking, the intuitive grasp of strategic concepts, even their uncanny ability to communicate without words, all of it made sense now as manifestations of abilities that went deeper than simple intelligence. "How long have you known?" he asked that evening as they sat around the fire. the silver pendant resting on the table between them like an accusation. "I first saw beyond the present during our flight from the village," Ragna admitted. "Glimpses of safe paths through dangerous terrain, warnings of trackers approaching from behind. I thought it was just fear and desperation making me more cautious." Tyra nodded, her fingers absently tracing patterns in the air as if following invisible threads only she could see. "Mine began the night we arrived here. I saw you standing in the stable doorway before you actually appeared. Saw your kindness in your eyes before you spoke. That's why I convinced Ragna to trust you." The weight of responsibility settled even heavier on Hroald's shoulders. These weren't just innocent women caught in a powerful man's web of cruelty. They were the last carriers of an ancient bloodline that could reshape the political landscape of the entire region. Grimm's determination to capture them alive suddenly made perfect strategic sense. "Show me what else you've seen," he said quietly. "Everything, no matter how fragmentary or confusing. Our survival may depend on understanding what's coming." The sisters exchanged their wordless communication, then Ragna lifted the pendant with obvious reluctance. As the silver touched her skin, her breathing grew shallow, and her eyes took on the same distant quality her twin had displayed. "I see the jarl himself," she whispered. "Larger than his reputation suggests, but not in the ways that matter. His cruelty masks fear, fear that his power rests on sand and could crumble if challenged by someone stronger. He brings more men than Bjorn claimed, nearly 70 warriors, because he cannot afford to fail again." Her voice grew strained as the vision deepened. "They approach in 3 groups, the main force up the southern trail, a smaller group from the east to pin us against the mountain, and—" She gasped, her eyes snapping wide. "A 3rd group moves through the forest to strike the cottage from behind. They plan to take us alive, but they'll burn everything else to ensure we have no place to run." Hroald absorbed this intelligence with the grim satisfaction of a commander whose tactical instincts had proven sound. The 3-pronged assault was exactly what he'd have ordered in Grimm's position, complex enough to ensure success, but not so elaborate as to invite confusion among relatively inexperienced warriors. "When?" he asked. Tyra took the pendant from her sister, her touch producing an immediate response. "Tomorrow night. They attack in the dark, using fire and noise to disorient us while the main assault comes from the south. But there's something else." She frowned, the vision clearly showing her something troubling. "I see betrayal within their ranks. Someone among Grimm's men will act against their jarl's interests, though I cannot tell if they help us or harm us." The tactical picture was becoming clearer, but also more dangerous. 70 warriors represented overwhelming force in any conventional sense, more than enough to storm their position regardless of preparation or skill. But conventional thinking had limitations that creative strategy could exploit, especially when the enemy's objectives were constrained by their need to take captives alive. "We need to change the terms of engagement," Hroald said, rising to pace before the fire. "They expect to find us here, trapped in our defensive positions and fighting to hold ground. Instead, we give them the cottage and make our real stand somewhere they don't expect." The sisters watched him work through the problem, their expressions showing the focused attention of people whose lives depended on the quality of his planning. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain peaks, carrying with it the promise of the storm that would provide cover for both attack and counterattack. "The old watchtower," Ragna said suddenly, her tactical insight proving as valuable as her mystical sight. 2 miles up the ridge, stone walls and a commanding view of all approaches. Abandoned for years, but still structurally sound. Hroald nodded approvingly. "Exactly what I was thinking. But getting there in time means abandoning most of our prepared positions and supplies. We'll be fighting with whatever we can carry." "Better to fight with mobility than to die trapped in a burning cottage," Tyra pointed out. "The visions show fire consuming everything here. If we remain, we burn with it." The decision made, they spent the remaining daylight hours in careful preparation. Essential supplies went into packs that could be carried quickly across rough terrain and darkness. weapons received final checks and sharpening. Most importantly, they rehearsed the route to the watchtower until each could navigate it blindfolded. As evening approached, Hroald made one final addition to their preparations. From the wooden chest beside his bed, he withdrew items that had lain untouched for 8 years: mail shirt, helm, and the wolfskin cloak that had marked his rank as war chief. The familiar weight of armor settled on his shoulders like the embrace of an old friend, and he felt the last vestiges of his peaceful farmer identity fall away. "You look like the stories now," Ragna observed as he adjusted the mail's fit. "Like the Iron Hand of legend rather than the gentle giant who showed us kindness." "Both are true," he replied, settling the helm on his graying head. "The gentle giant exists because the Iron Hand fought for the right to peace. Tonight, Iron Hand fights so the gentle giant can continue to exist." As full darkness settled over the mountains, they made their way from the cottage that had sheltered their growing friendship. The weathered wooden cross above the door caught the last light of their lantern as they departed, a silent benediction on the journey ahead. The trek to the watchtower proved as challenging as expected. Snow had begun falling in earnest, turning the already treacherous mountain paths into exercises in controlled falling. But the same conditions that made their movement difficult would hamper their enemies even more severely, especially warriors unaccustomed to highland terrain in winter weather. They reached the ancient stone tower, with hours to spare before the attack began. From its elevated position, they could see for miles in every direction, including the approach routes that Grimm's forces would have to use. More importantly, the tower's narrow stairs and thick walls would force any assault into the kind of close quarters, fighting where superior numbers mattered less than skill and determination. "They're coming," Tyra whispered, her eyes reflecting the silver glow of the pendant as she tracked movements invisible to normal sight. 3 groups, just as I saw. The main force is larger than expected. Nearly 80 men now. Word has spread and glory seekers have joined the hunt. Hroald felt a familiar calm settle over him as the moment of battle approached. This was the part of warfare he'd always understood best. The crystalline clarity that came when planning ended and action began, when the complexity of strategy reduced to the simple mathematics of strike and counterstrike. Below them, torches began to appear along the mountain paths like malevolent stars. Grim Bloodaxe was coming with overwhelming force, confident that numbers would succeed where earlier attempts had failed. But he was also walking into a trap prepared by someone who'd spent a lifetime turning superior numbers into tactical disadvantages. The old watchtower seemed to approve of their presence, its ancient stones radiating the accumulated strength of all who'd made their stands within its walls. Tonight, it would witness another chapter in the endless story of courage facing cruelty, of the few standing against the many in defense of what was right and good. The weathered wooden cross from Hroald's cottage door seemed to watch over them even at this distance, a reminder that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds, and that peace was never more precious than when it had to be defended with blood and steel. The first flames appeared at the cottage just before midnight, orange tongues licking hungrily at the wooden walls that had sheltered their unlikely family. From the watchtower's height, Hroald watched his home of 8 years consumed by fire, feeling each timber's destruction like a physical blow. The weathered wooden cross above his door vanished in a gout of flame that seemed to carry away the last vestiges of his peaceful years. "They're discovering we're not there," Ragna whispered, her eyes reflecting the distant firelight. "I can hear their shouts even at this distance. Confusion first, then anger." Tyra stood at the tower's eastern window, tracking movement through the forest below. "The flanking groups are converging on the cottage ruins. But look there, torches moving up the ridge toward us. Someone among them reasoned out our likely position." Hroald adjusted his grip on the battle axe, its familiar weight steadying his nerves as the moment of contact approached. "How many in the advance group?" 12 men, moving carefully but steadily. They'll reach the tower's base within the hour." Tyra's voice carried the certainty of mystical sight combined with practical observation. Behind them, the main force follows, 60 or more warriors led by Grim himself. The tactical situation was both better and worse than Hroald had hoped. Better because the enemy was spreading their forces across multiple objectives, diluting their overwhelming numerical advantage. Worse because the advanced scouts included men experienced enough to read terrain and think strategically about their quarry's likely movements. "The narrow stairs will force them to attack in single file," he said, more to himself than the sisters. "I can hold that choke point against considerable numbers, but only if you both remain safely above and out of reach." Ragnar's laugh held no humor. "We didn't come this far to cower in a tower while you face death alone. Our grandmother's sight shows me fragments of the battle to come, and in every vision where you fight unsupported, you fall beneath their numbers." "And in the visions where we help?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Tyra's expression grew troubled. "Those remain unclear. The future shifts and changes with each decision we make. But I see paths to victory that require all three of us playing our parts." Before Hroald could respond, the sound of steel on stone echoed up from below. The advanced scouts had reached the tower's base and begun their ascent. Their voices carried clearly in the cold mountain air, confirming what the sisters' visions had revealed about their numbers and intentions. 12 men, as you said," Hroald confirmed, moving to the stairwell that offered the only approach to their position. "Stay back from the windows until I call for you. Arrows can kill as surely from below as from above." The first warrior appeared at the stair's head with his sword already drawn, expecting to find frightened women rather than an armored giant wielding a legendary axe. His surprise lasted exactly as long as it took Hroald's blade to separate his head from his shoulders, the body tumbling back down the stairs to block the path for those following. "Iron Hand!" the second man shouted, his voice carrying both recognition and fear. "The legend spoke true. He lives still." But legends, however accurate, couldn't prepare men for the reality of facing a master warrior in his element. The narrow stairwell became a killing ground where numbers meant nothing and skill meant everything. Hroald's axe sang through the air in precise arcs, each stroke calculated to maximum efficiency in the confined space. The third and fourth attackers came together, hoping to overwhelm him through coordinated assault. Instead, they found themselves stumbling over their predecessor's corpse while trying to wield weapons in a space too narrow for proper sword play. Hroald's axe took them both with economical sweeps that sent their bodies cascading back toward their comrades. "Fall back!" someone shouted from below. "Regroup and wait for the jarl." But the damage was done. 4 bodies blocked the stairwell, and the remaining scouts had lost their nerve for storming a position held by someone whose reputation was proving thoroughly deserved. More importantly, the sounds of combat had carried across the mountainside, alerting Grim's main force to their quarry's actual location. "They're coming now," Tyra reported from her window. "The full force, torches streaming up the ridge like angry fireflies. Grim himself leads them. I can see his banner in the torchlight." Hroald moved away from the stairwell, knowing the next assault would be far more dangerous than the scouts' ill-coordinated attack. Grim had enough men to assault the tower from multiple directions simultaneously, and enough equipment to make their stone walls less of an advantage than they'd hoped. "What do your visions show now?" he asked, checking his weapons one final time. Ragna lifted the silver pendant, her eyes taking on that distant quality as she peered beyond the present moment. "I see fire again, but not the cottage this time. Fire climbing these very walls as they try to smoke us out. And I see." She gasped, her vision clearly showing something unexpected. Bjorn the Wise arguing with his jarl. Their dispute grows heated, and weapons are drawn between them. "The betrayal you mentioned," Hroald said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Grim's own counselor turns against him." "But not in time to prevent the assault," Tyra added grimly. "The tower burning, arrows flying like deadly rain, and you standing against impossible odds while we—" Her voice trailed off as the vision showed her something that made her face go pale. "What is it?" Hroald demanded. "I see us using our grandmother's pendant not just for sight, but as a weapon," she whispered. "The old runes blazing with power that burns like silver fire, but the cost—" She shook her head, unable or unwilling to voice what that power would demand. The sound of many feet on stone announced Grim's arrival at the tower's base. Unlike his scouts, the jarl took time to position his men properly, surrounding the structure and cutting off any possibility of escape. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the confidence of a man who held overwhelming advantage. "Hroald, Ironhand," he called out. "I offer one final chance for reason. Surrender the seers to me, and you may depart with your life. Refuse, and I'll take them from your corpse and burn this tower around your bones." Hroald's response echoed off the mountain walls with the finality of judgment. "Come and take them, Bloodaxe. But know that every step up these stairs will cost you blood, and victory will taste of ashes in your mouth." The roar of rage from below told him his words had found their mark. Grim Bloodaxe was not a man who accepted defiance gracefully, especially from someone whose reputation rivaled his own. When the assault came, it would be driven by fury as much as strategy, a combination that made enemies both more dangerous and more vulnerable to the right kind of response. The assault began with a rain of arrows that darkened the sky like a plague of locusts. Hroald and the sisters pressed themselves against the tower's inner walls as iron points struck stone and timber, some finding their way through the ancient windows to clatter harmlessly against the floor. The barrage lasted long enough to empty every quiver among Grim's men, a display of overwhelming force meant to terrorize rather than achieve tactical objectives. "Now they come," Hroald said grimly, listening to the coordinated shouts from below as warriors began their ascent on multiple sides. "Remember what we planned. Let them commit to the stairs before you act." Ragna and Tyra took their positions at opposite windows, the silver pendant passing between them as they tracked the assault's progress through mystical sight enhanced by desperate necessity. Below, torches revealed men climbing the tower's external walls, while others forced their way up the blood-slicked stairs over the bodies of their fallen comrades. The first wave struck like thunder against stone. Warriors poured up the stairwell in a wedge formation designed to overwhelm any defender through sheer momentum. But momentum meant little when channeled into a space that negated numerical advantage and favored the defender's superior position and skill. Hroald's axe carved through the leading warriors with mechanical precision, each stroke calculated to maximum effect in the confined space. Bodies fell back onto those behind, creating a barrier of corpses that forced subsequent attackers to climb over their fallen friends while defending against a weapon wielded by someone who'd perfected the art of close quarters killing. But the external assault proved more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Grappling hooks sailed through windows as warriors scaled the outer walls with ropes and determination. The first man through the eastern window met Tyra's arrow at point-blank range, but others followed quickly enough that she had to abandon her bow for the long knife they'd prepared. "The pendant!" Ragna called out as 3 warriors gained the chamber simultaneously. "Now, sister!" Tyra grasped the silver disc with both hands, and the ancient runes blazed with light that turned the tower's interior bright as noon. But this wasn't merely illumination. The light carried power that struck the attacking warriors like physical blows, sending them stumbling backward with cries of pain and terror. The pendant's power came at a cost that Hroald could see in Tyra's face as she wielded it. Each pulse of silver fire seemed to drain something vital from her, leaving her paler and more fragile with every use. Whatever abilities their grandmother's bloodline had gifted them, employing those gifts demanded a price that couldn't be paid indefinitely. "How long can you maintain it?" he called between axe strokes, his voice carrying over the sounds of battle and dying men. "Long enough," Tyra replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "The power grows with our desperation, but it burns like fire in our veins." The assault continued with the relentless pressure of ocean waves, each repulsed attack followed by another that probed for weakness or exploited tactical lessons learned from previous failures. Grim might be cruel and arrogant, but he commanded experienced warriors who adapted quickly to changing circumstances. "They're bringing ladders," Ragna reported, her own use of the pendant revealing preparations below. "Multiple approaches and men with shields to protect the climbers from our arrows." Hroald felt the familiar mathematics of warfare shifting against them. Numbers always told in the end, and Grim had enough men to sustain losses that would eventually overwhelm any defense. The tower that had seemed like salvation was becoming a trap that would hold them for their enemies' convenience. Then Bjorn the Wise's voice cut through the chaos from below, raised in heated argument with his jarl. "This is madness, Grim. You sacrifice good men for your pride, while the real prize slips away." "I'll hear no more counsel from you, old man," Grim snarled back. "The herb wives are mine by right, and no legend from the past will keep me from claiming what I'm owed." "What you're owed?" Bjorn's voice rose with outrage. "You're owed nothing but the grave your cruelty has earned. I'll see no more good men die for your wounded pride." The sound of steel on steel rang out from below as the argument turned violent. Through the battle's chaos, Hroald heard Grim's roar of pain and fury, followed by shouts of confusion as the jarl's own men found themselves facing divided loyalties in the midst of combat. "The betrayal," Ragna whispered, understanding dawning in her exhausted eyes. "Bjorn strikes against his lord, just as the visions showed. But can it save us?" The question hung in the air as the pendant's silver light began to flicker and fade, Tyra's strength finally reaching its limits. Below them, Grim's forces wavered as news of their leader's wounding spread through their ranks, but enough remained committed to the assault to ensure the tower's fall. In that moment of desperate extremity, with enemy warriors pouring through multiple breaches and the sisters' mystical defenses failing, Hroald made the choice that would define the battle's outcome. He abandoned the defensive position that had served them well and charged into the heart of the enemy formation, his legendary axe clearing a path through shocked warriors who'd expected him to fight defensively until the end. Spring returned to the Highland Mountains with unusual gentleness that year, as if nature itself sought to heal the wounds left by winter's violence. From the cottage that Hroald had rebuilt on the same foundation as the old, stronger now, with stones quarried from the ancient watchtower, the view stretched across valleys green with new growth and hope. The weathered wooden cross once again hung above his door, carved from timber salvaged from the ruins, but somehow more meaningful for having survived fire and destruction. It watched over a household that had grown in ways none of them could have anticipated during those dark days when violence seemed the only possible outcome. Ragna emerged from the herb garden they'd expanded to twice its former size, her hands stained green from the morning's work with healing plants. The silver pendant no longer hung around her neck. Its power had burned out completely during the final moments of the battle, leaving behind only ordinary metal and the memories of what had been accomplished through desperate courage. "The yarrow is coming in beautifully this year," she reported, settling beside Hroald at the wooden table that had been rebuilt larger than before. "Tyra thinks we'll have enough to supply half the valley's healing needs when harvest comes." From the stable came the sound of her sister's voice, gentle and patient, as she instructed the three young women who'd come seeking to learn the herb wives' arts. Word had spread of the battle at the watchtower, and with it, tales of the healing knowledge that had helped wounded men from both sides recover from injuries that should have been fatal. "Magnus sent word that the new apprentice-smiths are progressing well," Hroald said, gesturing toward the forge they'd built beside the cottage. "Strange how many young men want to learn metalworking from someone who once served kings." Ragna's smile carried the warmth of shared understanding. Perhaps they sensed that a man who chose peace after knowing war has lessons worth learning about both. The transformation of their isolated farm into something approaching a small settlement had happened gradually, organically, as people drawn by stories of courage and healing found reasons to stay. The watchtower had been rebuilt as well, though now it served as a school where Hroald taught the arts of defense to those who might one day need to protect what they held dear. "Any word from Bjorn?" Ragna asked, though she already knew the answer from his expression. "His messenger arrived this morning. Grim's holdings are finally stabilized under new leadership. Jarls who remember that strength comes from protecting people, not preying on them. Bjorn says the transition is complete and justice has been served for all who suffered under the old ways." The counselor who'd turned against his cruel lord in the battle's crucial moment had proven as skilled at rebuilding as he'd been at recognizing when destruction was necessary. Under his guidance, the territories once terrorized by grim bloodaxe had become examples of how power could be wielded with wisdom rather than cruelty. Tyra appeared in the doorway, followed by her 3 students, young women whose faces showed the particular glow that came from discovering purpose larger than themselves. The sight reminded Hroald of his first glimpse of the sisters in his stable, though these newcomers carried hope rather than desperation. "The afternoon lessons are finished," Tyra announced, settling at the table with the easy grace of someone who'd found her place in the world. "Tomorrow we begin practical work with the village midwife. She's agreed to let them assist with births, provided they can demonstrate proper knowledge of the assisting herbs." "And if they succeed?" Hroald asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Then they'll be ready to carry the knowledge to their own communities. Grandmother's teaching was always meant to spread, not be hoarded by a single bloodline." Tyra's expression grew thoughtful. "We lost the sight when the pendant burned out, but perhaps that's as it should be. The future is meant to be built through courage and wisdom, not glimpsed through mystical means." As evening approached, the expanded household gathered around the large table for the meal that had become their daily celebration of survival and community. The apprentice smiths joined them, along with the herb students and the handful of families who'd established homes within the farm's protective embrace. The conversation flowed with the comfortable rhythm of people who'd chosen to build something good together, who'd learned that family could be forged through shared purpose as surely as through blood. Stories were told, plans were made, and hopes were shared, with the openness that came from knowing they were all committed to protecting what they'd created. Later, after the others had retired to their homes and quarters, Hroald sat alone on the cottage steps, looking up at the stars that sparkled like distant promises above the mountain peaks. The weathered wooden cross caught the moonlight, its simple lines a reminder of the peace that had been lost, fought for, and ultimately found again in forms more precious than solitude. Behind him, soft voices drifted from the cottage as Ragna and Tyra planned the next day's work. Which plants to harvest, which students needed additional guidance, which neighbors might benefit from visits to check on their health and well-being. It was the sound of purpose being lived rather than merely contemplated. The herb wives had found their calling again, not as refugees or bearers of mystical gifts, but as healers whose knowledge served their community's needs. Hroald had discovered that his greatest victory wasn't the battle at the watchtower, but the choice to build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. In the distance, lights twinkled in the valley, where the village prospered under protection that no longer required isolation or violence. Children played in streets free from the fear that had once stalked them. Mothers gave birth attended by skilled hands that knew both the ancient plant lore and the gentleness that made healing possible. The weathered wooden cross watched over it all, symbol of a peace that had been tested by fire and blood, then rebuilt stronger than before through the determination of people who refused to let cruelty have the final word. As Hroald rose to join the sisters inside their home, for that was what it had become, truly and completely, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing some battles were worth fighting, some stands were worth making, and some forms of family were worth any sacrifice required to preserve them. The cottage door closed behind him with the soft sound of sanctuary secured, while above it all, the weathered wooden cross continued its eternal vigil over the peace they'd built together.